At the age of 69, Michael Biehn is one of the faces that has left a deep mark on the history of American cinema. A man who once helped create some of the most iconic films of Hollywood, from the role of Kyle Reese in The Terminator, the character that laid the foundation for an entire science fiction franchise worth billions of dollars, to Corporal Hicks in Aliens, one of the most highly regarded sequels of all time, and Lieutenant Coffee in The Abyss, where he showed a rare psychological depth in the action film genre, working directly with James Cameron on 3 major projects in a row, something very few actors have achieved, becoming part of films that received multiple Oscar nominations and were recognized as classics by the American Film Institute, continuing to make his mark with the role of Johnny Ringo in Tombstone, one of the most beloved villains in modern Western films, and throughout a career spanning more than 4 decades, he has appeared in dozens of film and television works, becoming a cult icon, especially honored by the fan community, frequently invited to major fan events in the United States where audiences call him the heart of the films you love, a person who does not need to top the box office charts, but is still an irreplaceable soul in the works that have defined an entire era. But behind all those achievements is another story, a story not written with titles or awards, but with long periods of emptiness, when the biggest opportunities quietly passed by without returning, when he stood very close to the position of an A-list star, but was gradually pushed out of the center of Hollywood, facing wrong choices in his personal life, especially the years struggling with alcohol that eroded not only his health, but also his precious career opportunities, making him watch the doors that once opened before his eyes gradually close. And throughout that period there was no loud collapse, only a prolonged silence, a feeling of being forgotten right in the place he once belonged to. But what makes Michael Biehn's story not end in tragedy is the fact that he has never truly left. He continues to work, continues to appear in smaller projects, continues to meet audiences, continues to hold on to his identity in an ever-changing industry, carrying invisible wounds, but also carrying a persistent will, as if he accepts that his life will not be remembered in the most brilliant way, but still chooses to keep moving forward, not to become a legend, but to prove that there are people who, even if they do not reach the peak that the world recognizes, still live long enough, resilient enough, for their story to finally be heard. Before we dive deeper into the story of the man who once stood very close to legend but was forgotten, please hit like and subscribe to the channel as a way of acknowledging a life that never gives up. Michael Biehn was not born into a tragic circumstance in the way Hollywood often tells it. There were no prolonged periods of hunger, no shocking incidents that changed an entire life overnight. He grew up in a family that, from the outside, everything was stable enough to be called adequate. Enough to eat, enough to live, enough to exist. But it was precisely because of that enough that there was nothing truly standout, no story big enough to make others stop and listen. And in such an environment, Michael was not the center of anything, not the most talented child, nor the child who faced the most difficulties. He was in the middle, in a place that people usually do not pay attention to, a place where a person's existence can easily pass by without leaving a trace. And from very early on, he learned something that no one taught, that to survive in this world, sometimes you do not need to stand out. You just need to be quiet enough not to be left behind. But that very silence gradually became a shadow that followed him throughout his growing years. In class, when other children were called by name, praised, noticed for something, Michael usually just sat there, observing, listening, and then disappeared when class ended. No one really remembered the boy who sat in the corner of the room. No one asked what he thought, what he felt, and no one realized that there was a child gradually learning to live without needing to be seen. Those years did not leave noisy memories. There were no dramatic stories, but they created a lingering feeling, a feeling that he was always standing outside his own life, as if watching others live instead of truly living. And over time, that feeling did not disappear, but only changed shape, becoming deeper, quieter, harder to name. He began to get used to not being expected of anything, used to no one placing faith in him. And when a person grows up without anyone really expecting anything from them, they will start to believe that they have nothing to prove. That is not despair, but a form of silent existence, not painful enough to cry out, but heavy enough to make every passing day carry a void that is hard to fill. Michael did not rebel, did not resist. He just continued to live, continued to go through his youth years like a shadow passing through a wall, present but leaving no trace. And right in that silence, something began to form, not ambition, nor a clear dream, but a very simple yet extremely profound need, the need to be seen, to be heard, to exist in a way that others could recognize. But at that time, he did not know how to achieve that. He only knew that he did not want to continue living as a name no one remembered, a face no one recognized, a life that passed by without leaving any trace. And it was that very feeling, the feeling of a child growing up in normality to the point of invisibility, that became the foundation for everything that would happen later. Because there are people who are not defeated by life through big shocks, but are gradually worn down by prolonged silence. And Michael Biehn grew up in that very silence, carrying it with him into every step, every choice, every opportunity, as an inseparable part of who he is. In his early years, stepping into adulthood, when most people begin to find a clear direction for their lives, Michael Biehn continued to drift in a very different way, with no big turning point, no groundbreaking decision, just days following one another in prolonged uncertainty. He tried many different jobs, jobs that were enough to make a living, but not enough to create any sense of belonging, jobs that one could leave at any time without leaving a trace. And they were also the kind of jobs where, if he disappeared, no one would really notice. Each morning began without a clear goal. Each evening ended with nothing worth remembering. Time passed without noise, without pain, but it carried an increasingly large feeling of emptiness, as if he was living in a temporary life, a life that even he himself was not sure he belonged to or not. And the scariest thing was not failure, but the fact that there was no failure big enough to force him to change, no fall that made him have to stand up stronger. Only a chain of repeating days, regular, invisible, causing a person to gradually lose direction without realizing it. You could not point out the moment when everything started to go wrong, because there was no such moment. Everything simply slipped away, slowly and continuously, and in that process, a question began to form, at first very faint, but becoming clearer over time. Where am I going? And even scarier, am I even going anywhere? Michael was not the only person to experience this feeling, but what made it heavier was that he had no support to hold on to, no dream strong enough to pull him out of the drifting, no one standing beside him to say that he was on the right path. He only had himself, and an increasingly large feeling that if he continued like this life would pass by without leaving any mark. Those years were not recorded by big failures or memorable victories, but by the absence of both. And it was that very absence that made a person the most tired, because when you fail, at least you know you have tried, but when you simply exist, you start to wonder if you are even living. And Michael had lived in that state longer than anyone around him realized. He continued to try, continued to change, continued to search for something that even he could not name. But each attempt ended in the same familiar feeling. Not disappointment, but emptiness. Not pain, but fatigue. And over time, those feelings began to accumulate, not exploding, not destroying, but quietly eroding, making him gradually lose faith that there was somewhere in this world truly meant for him, that there was some path he belonged to. And right in those nameless drifting years, Michael Biehn began to stand before an invisible boundary, not between success and failure, but between continuing to search and accepting that he might never find it, and that was one of the most dangerous boundaries a person could face. Because when you start accepting that you do not belong anywhere, you no longer fight to change, you just continue to exist, quietly, regularly, in the way he had lived throughout the previous years. But deep inside, some part had not completely gone out. A very small, very fragile part, still waiting for an opportunity, not to become someone great, but just to be seen. And that very small part, though fragile to the point of almost not existing, was the only thing preventing him from drifting completely away from his own life. And then, in a seemingly very small moment, with no bright lights, no pounding music, no one realizing that something important was beginning, Michael Biehn stepped into the world of acting for the first time, not with the ambition to become a star, but simply to try something different, something that could make him feel like he was living instead of just existing. And right in that first time standing on stage, a strange but intense feeling appeared, not the usual nervousness, but a feeling he had never experienced before. The feeling of being seen, of being heard, of existing in a way that others could not ignore. For the first time in his life, other people's eyes did not glance past him, but stopped. For the first time, the silence around him was not a sign of being forgotten, but a sign that people were paying attention. And in that moment, something inside him changed. Not noisily, not suddenly, but deep enough to make him realize that perhaps this was the only place where he was no longer a shadow on stage. He was no longer Michael, the quiet, vague, directionless man, but could become anyone. Someone strong, someone in pain, someone loved, someone lost. And in that process, he began to understand that his value did not lie in how the world saw him, but in what he could make the world feel. Acting was no longer a career choice, but became a way for him to exist, a way for him to escape the invisibility that had followed him throughout his childhood and adult years. Each time standing on stage, he was not only performing, but proving to himself that he could be part of this world, that he could leave a trace, even if only in a few short minutes. And the strange thing was, the more he acted, the clearer he felt about himself, as if every character he embodied helped him understand a little more about his true self, the emotions he had never dared to express in real life, the thoughts he had never spoken, all found their way through the roles, and for the first time, life was no longer a chain of meaningless repeating days, but began to have direction, even if still faint, even if still unclear. But at least he knew that he did not want to go back to his old self, did not want to go back to a drifting life without purpose, did not want to continue being a name that no one remembered. And it was from there that a decision gradually formed, not a big declaration, not a turning point marked by memorable events, but a quiet, steadfast choice that he would pursue this path, even if he did not know where it would lead, even if he did not know if he would succeed or not. But at least it was the only path that made him feel like he was truly existing. And sometimes, for a person who had lived too long in invisibility, just existing in a way that others could see was already big enough to trade an entire life for. But the path that Michael Biehn had chosen was not a path leading straight to the light, but a long journey in closed rooms, where the lights did not shine on the stage but shone straight on the faces of those waiting to be judged. The auditions began to follow one after another, day after day, week after week, and then month after month, he stepped into each room with the same small hope that this time it might be different. That this time someone would see what he had started to believe he had. But most of the time, everything ended the same. A polite nod, a quick thank you, and then the door closed behind him, leaving a long and quiet hallway, where he returned to himself again. No role, no explanation, only a familiar feeling that he had not been enough. Not that he lacked ability, but that he was not enough to be chosen, And what made these rejections more uncomfortable was that he was often not eliminated right from the start. He passed the first round, sometimes the second round, sometimes got called back, sometimes was told, "so close." And those very words, "so close," became a burden, because they did not allow him to let go, but they were not enough to keep him there. They placed him in a halfway position, where he could not turn back but also could not move forward, and each time like that, he would go back, study the script again, try again, step into another room with the same hope that had begun to thin over time. The casting rooms were not the same in size, not the same in lighting, but they were the same in one single point. That was the coldness, not because of the temperature, but because of the feeling that you were just one of dozens, hundreds of other people trying to seize the same opportunity. And among them, only one person was chosen, while all the rest returned to silence. Michael gradually got used to it. Got used to preparing, got used to disappointment, got used to continuing without any sign that anything would change. And sometimes what made him tired was not being rejected, but not having an answer. No one told him what he lacked. No one pointed out where he needed to change. Everything just ended without leaving a trace, as if he had never been there, as if his effort was not big enough to be recognized. And in those moments, the question began to return, like the drifting years before, do I really belong here? But this time, unlike before, he was no longer completely aimless, because he had known the feeling of existing on stage. He had known the feeling of being seen, and that very memory did not allow him to give up. Even though all signs said he should stop, he continued, not because he was sure he would succeed, but because he no longer had any other path that made him feel meaningful, and therefore he returned, time after time, carrying the same script, the same voice, the same look, hoping that somewhere, in some room, there would be someone who saw what others had overlooked. But time kept passing, and the rejections began to pile up, not creating a big collapse, but creating a quiet, prolonged pressure, making each step heavier, each hope more fragile. And each time stepping into the casting room, he not only brought the character, but also brought all the previous times he was not chosen. And that made everything much more difficult, because when you start doubting yourself, you are not only performing in front of others, but also trying to convince yourself that you deserve to be there. And that is a battle that no one sees. No one judges, but decides everything. And Michael Biehn had lived in that battle longer than anyone knew, always very close to the opportunity, always good enough to be considered, but in some way, never the one finally chosen, and that very almost feeling, repeating through the years, had become one of the hardest to name pains in his life, because it did not allow him to give up, but it also did not allow him to reach what he had been pursuing for that long period of time. In the end, after all those years standing in rooms where the door always closed behind him, Michael Biehn finally stepped into a different space, not because a miracle appeared suddenly, but as the result of persistence stretched almost to exhaustion when he met James Cameron, a director who at that time was still on the path to establishing his name, and this very encounter opened a door that Michael had been waiting for many years, not because it guaranteed success, but because, for the first time, there was someone who saw what he had tried to prove in countless auditions before, and from there, the role of Kyle Reese in the Terminator appeared. A soldier from the future, carrying both despair and love in the same person, a character that required not only strength, but also emotional depth. And Michael brought into it everything he had, all the years of rejection, all the feelings of not being seen, all the times he had to convince himself that he had value, and that very thing made Kyle Reese not just a character, but a real human being. A tired, frightened man who still kept fighting, and when the film was released, the world began to notice, not in a loud way, not with big titles, but enough for him to no longer be an invisible name, and then opportunities continued to come, not by chance, but as the continuation of a trust that had been placed in the right place when he returned in Aliens with the role of Hicks, another soldier, but this time not the one carrying despair, but the one who kept calm amid chaos. A character who did not need to speak too much, did not need to become the center of every shot, but was the anchor for the entire story. And once again, Michael did not do anything loud, he did not try to stand out. He just did exactly what he had always done, living inside the character, and that very authenticity made him recognized, not by the press or the media, but by those who understood the craft, those who saw that he was not only acting, but that he believed in what he was doing. And then came The Abyss, where he embodied Coffee, a more complex, darker character, carrying tension and gradually losing control. A role that demanded not only technique, but also the courage to step into the dark corners of a person. And Michael did that without hesitation, continuing to prove that he was not only suited for one type of role, but could go further, deeper, and throughout this period, he became a familiar face in major projects, a person that directors trusted, a person that films needed to keep the story with depth. But the strange thing was, even though he was there, even though he had appeared in works that changed the entire industry, he was still not the center. His name never stood at the top. His image was not what was used to sell tickets. He stood right next to greatness, but he was not what the light shone on. And perhaps that very thing created a paradox that few noticed at the time. That Michael Biehn had achieved what so many actors dreamed of, working with top directors, appearing in classic films, being recognized for his acting ability, but at the same time, he was also moving closer to a dangerous gap. The gap between being seen and being remembered. Because in Hollywood, not everyone who contributes to success will be called a star, and Michael, even though he had stood very close, even though he had touched the greatest things in cinema, was still in a position where just one wrong step, one opportunity that did not come, one decision at the wrong time, everything he had built might not be enough to keep him in the center. And at that moment, when everything seemed to be opening up, when the path seemed clear, no one, not even himself, could see that what he had, no matter how valuable, was still not a guarantee for the future, because sometimes standing next to greatness does not mean becoming a part of it forever. And Michael Biehn was right at that boundary, a boundary that only later would he fully understand how close he had stood, and how far he had drifted from it. After the years of working consecutively on major projects, when Michael Biehn had become a familiar face in the films that defined an entire era of Hollywood, there was a period when, from the outside looking in, everything seemed to be going in the right direction. He appeared regularly. His name began to be known. Directors trusted him. Colleagues respected him. And if one only looked at the chain of roles in the Terminator, Aliens, and The Abyss, people could easily believe that he was on the path to becoming one of the next big stars of the film industry. But there was one important thing that no one realized at that time, not even himself, which was that the success he was having was not the kind of success that Hollywood keeps for long. He was highly regarded, but not widely promoted, recognized within the industry, but not pushed to become a mainstream icon, and that created a very small but extremely dangerous gap. The gap between becoming a respected actor and becoming a reputed star. Michael did not build a clear personal image for himself, did not appear in magazines the way other stars did not participate in big publicity campaigns. He focused on the work, on each role, on doing the best he could in every shot, and in a world where image is sometimes no less important than ability, that choice, though true to who he was, unintentionally made him fade in the eyes of the public. Success still came, but it did not stay. The light still shone on him, but it did not keep him in the center. Each film helped him take one more step, but none of the steps was big enough to bring him to an irreplaceable position, and over time, that began to show more clearly. When other faces, Those with clearer strategies, with stronger support from the Hollywood system, began to move ahead, not because they were better, but because they were seen more. And meanwhile, Michael continued to work, continued to deliver authentic performances, continued to be an important part of big stories. But gradually, his role no longer lay in the center, but moved back, not because he changed, but because the way the world looked at him began to change. And the hardest thing to notice in this period was that there was no clear moment marking that shift. There was no day when he woke up and knew that everything had changed. It all happened very slowly, very lightly, enough not to cause panic, but enough over time to create an increasingly large gap between where he was standing and where he once thought he would go, and that was exactly what made this period heavy. Because if there was a collapse, at least people could point to it, could understand it, could react to it. But when success simply did not last, when the light simply gradually left without leaving a clear void, a person would continue to walk without realizing that he was moving away from the center. And Michael Biehn had walked through that period like that, still working, still believing that he was moving forward. But deep inside, something had begun to change, something he could not yet name, but could feel, that the position he had, no matter how valuable, was still not solid enough to keep him when the flow of Hollywood continued to move. And when he looked back later, the most painful thing was not that he did not become a superstar, but that he had been so close that just one thing different, one different opportunity, one different choice, everything could have changed completely. But in reality, that success only existed for a short period of time. And then, like the light at the end of the day, it gradually faded, leaving behind a man who still stood there, still working, but no longer in the place where the light shone. And then, right after Aliens brought Michael Biehn closer than ever to the position that so many actors dreamed of, a door seemed to have opened before his eyes. Not a small door like the previous auditions, but a door leading straight to the center of Hollywood, where the chosen names would become the faces representing an entire generation. And in that moment, every sign showed that he could step through. He had strong enough roles, recognition from top directors like James Cameron, an image that fit the booming action film genre, and, more importantly, he had proven that he was not just a supporting actor, but someone who could bring both emotion and depth to big stories. But what no one said out loud, what no one prepared him for, was that having potential and having position were two completely different things. And in the time that followed, when new projects began to be planned, when studios looked for faces for the next big roles, Michael's name did not appear where he thought he had reached. There was no clear explanation. There was no specific decision that could be pointed to. It was just a chain of opportunities that did not come. Roles he was not called for, lists he was not on. And at first, it was not too obvious, because he was still working, still getting roles, still appearing in films. But as time went on, the gap between what he could do and what he was actually given began to become more pronounced. He saw big projects given to others, faces that sometimes he knew he could take on but had no chance to prove. And it was in those moments that an uncomfortable feeling began to form, not jealousy, but a repeating question. Why not me? A question with no clear answer. Because Hollywood does not operate by simple rules, it is not that doing well means you will be chosen. It is not that having talent means you will be pushed forward. There is also image, there is strategy, there is timing, there are factors that sometimes no one can control. And Michael, who had spent most of his life focusing on doing the job well, did not have those factors on his side. He did not build an image strong enough to compete with the rising names. He did not have a system behind him to promote. And gradually, what at first was just opportunities that did not come, became an unavoidable reality, that he was standing in a position where his potential was greater than what he was given. And that was one of the most painful gaps a person could experience, because when you lack ability, you can accept it, But when you know you can do more but have no opportunity to do it, you begin to carry a lingering feeling of incompleteness. And that feeling does not disappear over time. It accumulates, it grows, and it changes the way you see yourself. Michael did not stop. He continued to work, continued to take the roles that came to him, but deep inside, he began to understand that the moment that should have changed everything had passed, not by a collapse, but by a silence, an absence, a void that no one could point out exactly when it appeared, only knowing that when looking back, it had been there for a very long time. And what made it heavier was that he had been so close, close enough to feel it, close enough that just one more step, everything could have been different. But in reality, that step never happened, and his life continued, not in the direction he once thought, but on a different path, a path where every step carried a question without an answer, that if that moment had been held, if that opportunity had truly come, would everything that happened afterward still be the same or not? And that very question, unanswered, unclosed, had become an inseparable part of Michael Biehn's story. A story not about not having opportunities, but about opportunities that had appeared, but did not stay long enough to change everything. After the moment that could have changed everything but passed by in silence, Michael Biehn's career did not collapse in the way people usually imagine. There was no disastrously failed film, no major scandal that dragged his name down, no clear enough incident to mark an ending point. But everything happened in a slower, lighter way, almost impossible to notice if only looking in a short period of time. The number of roles began to decrease gradually, not immediately, but little by little. The invitations became fewer. The projects no longer carried the scale they once had. And more importantly, the big Hollywood films where he once had a place began to continue without him. The stories were still told, the characters were still built, but his face was no longer in them. And what made this change so hard to accept was that there was no specific reason that could be pointed to. No one told him that he was no longer suitable. No one officially closed the door. It simply no longer opened. And in an industry that is always moving, not moving forward sometimes means being left behind. Even if you are still standing still, Michael still worked. He did not disappear. He did not abandon acting. He continued to take the roles that came to him. But the scale had changed, the influence had changed, and his position in each project also changed. From someone who once helped create the soul of the story, he gradually became a smaller part in the films where he could once stand close to the center. And that did not happen in one day. There was no moment he could look back on and say, "This is when everything started to go downhill." Because it did not start, it just happened, slowly and continuously, like water draining away without making a sound. And when he realized it, when he truly looked back, the gap between where he was standing and where he once was had become too large to narrow down easily. New faces appeared, new trends formed. Hollywood did not stop to wait for anyone, and meanwhile, Michael continued to walk, continued to do the work he had chosen. But each step now no longer carried the feeling of moving forward, but felt more like an effort to keep himself from falling too far behind. And what made this period heavy was not that he was no longer at the peak, but that he was still close enough to remember he had once been there, still close enough to see the difference between the past and the present. And that very awareness, stretching through the years, made everything more difficult. Because when you have never touched something, you can accept not having it. But when you have been very close, have been part of something great, losing that position, even without a clear collapse, still leaves a void that is not easy to fill. And Michael Biehn lived in that void, continuing to work, continuing to appear, continuing to keep himself in the industry that had once brought him close to the peak, but no longer in the position where the light shone. No longer the name that was called when big stories began. Just someone who was still there, still existing, but gradually becoming harder to see in the eyes of a world that is always looking for new faces to replace those who once stood before it. In the period when everything on the outside gradually became quiet, when the invitations no longer came in waves and the lights no longer shone on the same position as before, Michael Biehn's real battle began to take place in a place no one could see, not on the film set, not in front of the camera, but in his own private life, where there was no script, no director, and no one standing there to tell him what to do next. The evenings grew longer, the silences became deeper, and in those silences, alcohol began to appear. At first, not as a problem, but as a way to fill the voids he did not know how to face, a way to soothe the feeling that everything was slipping out of his hands without a clear explanation, a way to temporarily forget the questions he could not answer. But like many things in life, what starts small often does not stop there, and over time, alcohol was no longer a choice, but became a habit, then gradually became a part of daily life, affecting the way he thought, the way he worked, the way he made decisions. And the most dangerous thing was that those effects did not appear immediately, not clear enough to make him stop, but accumulated little by little, blurring the line between control and losing control, making him continue to believe that he was still okay, that everything was still within reach, even as reality began to change in a different direction, and meanwhile, work began to reflect those changes. Opportunities became fewer, not only because Hollywood was changing, but also because personal factors started to affect how others saw him. Work sessions were no longer as stable as before. Decisions were no longer as clear as before. And in an industry where reliability is an important part of success, those small signs gradually became bigger barriers. But what made everything more complicated was that he was still there, still had ability, still had experience, still had everything that had once brought him close to the peak, and that very thing created a tug-of-war that was not easy to resolve. One part of him wanted to continue, wanted to prove that everything was not over, that he could still come back. But another part began to grow tired, began to question whether all those efforts still had meaning or not, whether the path he had walked for so many years still led anywhere anymore. And in that tug-of-war, choices began to become more difficult, not because he did not know what was right, but because he was no longer sure he had enough strength to carry them out. And sometimes, those very moments of weakness led to decisions that later he would look back on with regret. Not big mistakes that could change everything immediately, but small choices, repeated, each time a little, but over time, they formed a path where turning back became increasingly difficult, and throughout that process, no one really saw the battle he was going through, because on the outside he was still an actor, still appeared, still worked, still continued, but inside, everything was no longer as simple as before. Each day became a balance between keeping himself from falling too deep and finding something that had begun to slip away. And perhaps the most painful thing was not that he had to face those problems, but that he had to face them alone, without an audience, without recognition, without any sign of when that battle would end. Only a man who had once stood very close to greatness, now trying to hold on to himself in a war that no one saw, no one told, but decided everything that would happen afterward. And while Michael Biehn's inner battle continued quietly, the outside world did not stand still waiting for him to find balance. Hollywood continued to change in the way it always changes, faster, colder, and less forgiving to those who were no longer in the right place at the right time. A new generation of actors began to appear, bringing new images, new energy, and more importantly, they were built in the way the industry needed at that time, heavily promoted, placed at the center of big campaigns, and in that process the old faces, no matter how important they once were gradually pushed to the edge, not because they lost their ability, but because they no longer fit the new picture Hollywood was painting. And Michael began to feel it clearly, not through an official announcement, not through a direct rejection, but through the increasingly large gaps in his work schedule, through the projects he was no longer mentioned in, through the calls that no longer came. And what made this change so hard to accept was that there was no specific moment for him to say, "This is when everything ended." Because it did not end. It just continued without him. Films were still produced, roles were still given, but his name was no longer on the priority list. Not that he was eliminated, not that he no longer had value, but simply that he was no longer the first choice. And in an industry where position is decided by priority, no longer being prioritized almost means being pushed out of the center, and over time, that gap became more pronounced. What once were familiar opportunities now became distant. What once were natural positions now became something he had to strive for. And in that process, a feeling began to form, not anger, not resistance, but a slow realization that the world had changed in a way he could not control, that the path he once walked no longer led to the same place. And the hardest thing was not accepting that change, but continuing to walk in a world where he no longer stood in the familiar position. He was still there, still working, still appearing, but no longer at the center, no longer part of the big stories, no longer the person the industry revolved around, and that created a gap not only in his career, but in the very way he saw himself. Because when you have spent your whole life becoming part of a world, and then that world continues without you, you begin to wonder what your real place is. Michael did not disappear. He did not leave. He just stepped back, step by step, while Hollywood moved forward, and in that shift, there was no loud noise, no special attention. Only a man gradually standing outside the center of the industry he had once come so close to, carrying everything he had done, all the roles that had once made audiences believe in the story, but now having to learn how to exist in a new reality, where the light no longer shone on him as before, and where continuing was no longer to move forward, but to not completely disappear from a world that had once been almost everything to him. While the outside world of Michael Biehn gradually changed in a way he could not control, his personal life also did not stand still, but went through fluctuations at its own rhythm, not loudly, not displayed in front of the public, but deep enough to leave cracks stretching through the years. Relationships came and went, not always ending in dramatic breakups, but often just gradual distance, when two people no longer stood at the same pace in life, when pressures from work, from changes in his career, began to creep into private moments, making what once bound them become more fragile. His marriage was not a perfect story, nor was it a great tragedy, but a series of efforts, adjustments, attempts to hold on to something that was gradually slipping out of reach. And in all of that, there was one role he could not ignore. The role of a father, a role that did not depend on stage lights, did not depend on whether he was at the peak or not, but was directly affected by everything happening around him when his career was unstable, when opportunities no longer came as before, when he himself was facing his own battles. Keeping his presence in the family became no small challenge, not because he did not want to, but because sometimes he did not know how to balance finding himself again and keeping the important people in his life. Distances began to appear, not immediately, but little by little, through days he was not there, through postponed conversations, through moments when he should have been there but could not. And over time, those distances became clearer, not a complete breakdown, but a prolonged fragility, where everything still existed but was no longer as solid as before. And in that context, each relationship became something he had to try to hold on to, not with big words, but with small actions, quiet efforts, sometimes not enough to change everything, but enough to prove that he still cared, still wanted to keep what remained. And what made this period special was that it had no clear ending point, no moment when everything completely fell apart, but was a long process, where love, loss, and fragile connections coexisted, intertwined, forming a part of life that could not be separated. Michael was not perfect in his relationships. He had made mistakes. There were times he was not there when needed. There were choices that later looking back he might wish he had done differently, but the important thing was that he did not completely abandon them. He did not turn his back on the important people. He continued to try, in his own way, within his own ability, to keep the connections that life had brought. And in a world where everything can change very quickly, where a career can rise and fall due to factors beyond control, relationships became one of the few things he could hold on to, even if imperfect, even if unstable, but still existing. And that very existence, no matter how fragile, also gave him a support, a reason to keep moving forward, even when the road ahead was no longer as clear as before. And then, when what once belonged to the center gradually receded into the background, Michael Biehn began to step into another phase of his life, no longer tied to big-scale films, no longer part of projects the whole world was waiting for, but shifting to smaller works, independent films, stories without huge budgets, without massive promotional campaigns, but carrying something he no longer found in Hollywood before, which was freedom. Freedom to choose roles, freedom to work in his own way, freedom to exist without chasing expectations he no longer belonged to. These films did not bring him back to the peak, did not change the way the world saw him broadly, but they gave him something else. A feeling that he was still here, still doing what he had chosen from long ago, and in that process he began to appear more in other places, not on the red carpets of big premieres, but at smaller events, fan meet and greets, where people still remembered him, still remembered Kyle Reese, Hicks, Coffey, still saw value in the roles he had brought, and in those moments, when he stood before audiences that were not millions, but a small group of people who truly cared, something different began to form. Not fame, but connection. A recognition that did not come from the system, but from individuals. People who had kept his image through time, and that, in some way, brought a different meaning. Not loud, not brilliant, but more authentic. His life also gradually changed to that rhythm, no longer dominated by a dense schedule, no longer under constant pressure to maintain position, no longer the feeling of chasing something that was gradually slipping away. Instead, it was a slower, quieter pace of life, where each day was no longer defined by what he achieved, but by the fact that he still continued, still worked, still appeared, even if no longer in a prominent position. And it was in that silence that something he might not have realized before began to become clearer. That the value of a person does not only lie in where they stand in the eyes of the world, but also in whether they continue to walk when the light no longer shines on them. Michael did not return to the peak. He did not have a loud comeback that changed everything. He just continued, step by step, in small projects, in roles that were no longer widely noticed, but still carrying the same authenticity he had always kept. And perhaps that was exactly what made this period important, because it was not a story about regaining what was lost, but a story about learning to live without what once defined him. A life no longer at the center, but also not completely lost. A life existing at the edge of the light, where not many people saw it, but there was still enough light to keep walking. And in that silence, Michael Biehn was no longer someone trying to become something bigger, but someone accepting his path, with everything that had happened, everything that had not happened, and everything that still remained. And then, while Michael Biehn's life had gradually settled into a quiet rhythm, with no more major fluctuations, no more expectations to return to the center, something unexpected began to happen, not loudly, not initiated by Hollywood, but coming from somewhere else, from the very audiences who had once watched him, once felt his roles that perhaps, before they did not realize the real value of, over time, when films like The Terminator, Aliens, The Abyss were looked back on, analyzed, and celebrated as classics of American cinema, new questions began to appear, not about the story, not about the effects, but about the people who created those moments. And in those conversations, Michael's name began to be mentioned more, not as a big star, but as someone who had contributed more than what he had once been recognized for. Fans began to look back at his roles with a different perspective. They realized that the characters he portrayed were not just supporting parts in the story, but emotional anchors, indispensable pieces that made the story feel real. And gradually, a term began to appear. Underrated, a word that at first sounded simple, but carried a very big meaning, because it did not only say that he was good, but also that he had not been properly recognized for a long time. And what was special was that this recognition did not come from awards, did not come from big organizations, did not come from the systems that once decided who was a star, but came from the community, from moviegoers, from people who had kept memories of his roles, from meet-and-greet events where they told him they still remembered, that they still treasured what he had done. And in those moments, something began to change. Not in his career, but in the way he was perceived, not as an actor who had once been there and then disappeared, but as a part of what had existed and still held value. The films he participated in, over time, were not forgotten, but became bigger, became standards, works that later generations continued to watch, continued to learn from, and in that process, his role was also looked back on, placed in its proper position, not at the center of the lights, but at the center of emotion. And what made all of this special was that it came late, not when he was at the peak, not when he was still in a position to use it to change his career, but after everything had settled down, after he had stepped out of the race he had once joined, and perhaps precisely because of that, it carried a different feeling, not a victory, but an acknowledgement, not full compensation, but a reminder that what he had done did not disappear. It had just taken time to be seen. And when his name was mentioned again after many years of silence, not with the noise of the media, but with the respect of people who truly understood his value, it did not change the past, did not bring him back to the position he had once come close to touching, but it brought something he might no longer expect, that his story, even if not told in the biggest way, was still not completely forgotten, and sometimes, in a life where many things had not happened as expected, being remembered, even late, is still something meaningful in a way that no title can replace. While looking back at Michael Biehn's entire journey, from the nameless, drifting years of his youth, to the rare moments of standing in the light of great films, and then quietly stepping out of the center without a clear collapse, what emerges is not a victory story in the way Hollywood usually tells it, but a long journey of existence, a journey where every step carries the things that did not happen, the opportunities that came but did not stay, the moments that seemed like they could change everything but then passed without leaving results. He did not become a superstar. He did not have his name on the big charts. He was not mentioned as the commercial icons of the industry, but that does not mean he disappeared. He was still there, still working, still appearing in projects that might not be widely noticed, but still carrying the same authenticity he had always kept from the very beginning. And perhaps that very continuation is what defines the man more than any title, because in a world where success is often measured by the level of fame, existing without the lights, continuing without major recognition, requires a different kind of strength, a kind of strength that is not loud, not easy to see, but more enduring. Michael did not win in the way the world expected, but he also did not give up. He did not leave the industry, did not turn his back on the path he had chosen, even though that path did not lead him to where he once hoped. And over time, what he left behind was not in the number of awards or his position in the Hollywood system, but in the roles that entered the memory of audiences, the characters that people still remember, still mention, still feel every time those films are watched again. He did not need to stand at the center to become an important part of the story, and perhaps that is exactly what his life proved. that there are people who are not made to win in a clear way, not placed in the position of leaders, but still play a role that, if missing, everything would not be the same. And when, looking at the present, when the lights have receded far, when the big opportunities are no longer ahead, Michael B. does not stand there with clear regret, but with a quiet acceptance. He has gone through everything life brought, both what he had and what he did not have, both the moments he was seen and the years he was forgotten. And even though that life was not perfect, not complete in the way people usually expect, it still continued, day by day, step by step, without stopping, without ending. Because sometimes, in a world where victory is defined too clearly, the fact that a person still continues to walk, still holds on to himself, still exists through everything that was lost, is a form of victory that not everyone can achieve. Michael Biehn's story does not make people heartbroken because of a dramatic collapse, but because of its prolonged silence, from a boy growing up in a feeling of invisibility, unnoticed, to a man who once stood in the middle of great films like The Terminator, Aliens, The Abyss, where he brought emotional depth to characters that the whole world still remembers, but then had to witness the moment that was supposed to change his life pass without leaving results. When his name did not appear in the next big projects, when the light gradually left without any explanation, and that pain became even heavier because it did not end in his career, but continued to creep into his personal life. Through the years he struggled with alcohol, through the distances in his family that he tried to keep, but was not always successful. All of that created a life that did not lack talent, did not lack opportunities, but lacked one very small thing that decided everything: the maintenance of the right timing and the right choice at the right moment. And that very thing makes his story closer to American society than any perfect legend. Because in a country that values opportunity and success, not everyone becomes the one at the top. There are people who work hard, have talent, have opportunities, but still have to live with what almost achieved. And the lesson here does not lie in having to win at all costs, but in the way a person continues to exist when victory does not come, the way Michael Biehn still continues to work in small projects, still appears in front of fans, still keeps his identity even when no longer at the center. And that reflects a very real value in American life. The value of resilience, of not giving up even when you are not recognized in the way you deserve. Because in the end, not everyone is remembered as a legend, but the way you live after the lights go out is what defines who you are. If the story of Michael Biehn makes you think about unfulfilled dreams, please hit subscribe and leave a like as a way of appreciating those who still continue to walk even without the lights. Thank you for listening, and see you in the next video, where we will continue to explore imperfect lives but full of meaning.